They say in war, the enemy wears a uniform. But in Vietnam, some of the deadliest threats didn't carry rifles or speak Vietnamese. They slithered, crawled, buzzed, and bit. They lived in the mud, in the trees, in the boots of exhausted men. And sometimes they killed without making a sound. Australian soldiers, especially the SAS, were no strangers to jungle warfare. They had fought in Malaya and Borneo. They had trained for heat, for rain, for mud. But nothing prepared them for the invisible enemies of Vietnam. The kind that didn't shoot at you. They just waited for you to step too close, or lie down in the wrong place, or ignore that strange itching on your leg. One patrol lost a man not to gunfire, but to a bite from something no one ever saw. He simply went pale, began to shake, and slipped into unconsciousness. Hours later, the team had to decide whether to carry him through thick jungle under threat of detection or leave him behind. No bullet, no firefight, just venom, heat, and silence. In the steamy green hell of Phuoc Tuy, or along the border near Laos, the jungle was more than terrain. It was an ecosystem designed to break men, physically, mentally, and spiritually. The enemy could be hiding 20 meters away or living in your boot. This is the story of wildlife, the invisible enemy, the snakes, leeches, insects, and parasites that turn the jungle into a living battlefield. For the Australian SAS, surviving Vietnam meant fighting more than the Viet Cong. It meant surviving the jungle itself, and it didn't care if you lived or died. Because in Vietnam, sometimes the jungle was the deadliest enemy of all. To most outsiders, the jungle looked like just another kind of terrain. Green, dense, unpredictable. But for the soldiers who fought in Vietnam, especially the Australians who patrolled deep in its heart, the jungle was something else entirely. It wasn't just an environment, it was a predator. One that never slept, never showed its face, and never forgave a single mistake. Vietnam's jungles weren't like the humid rainforests of Malaya or Borneo that Australian SAS had trained in. They were darker, wetter, louder, and somehow more alive. The canopy above filtered sunlight into a constant green haze. Beneath it, the world was a soup of rotting leaves, tangled vines, and standing water filled with larvae and disease. The air never dried. Nothing stayed clean. Every scratch risked infection. Every breath pulled in spores. Every patch of ground could be the last one you ever stood on. You didn't just walk through this jungle, you negotiated with it, step by step, breath by breath. Even the most hardened SAS operators, men trained to live off the land and move unseen, found themselves outmatched by the sheer hostility of the Vietnamese wilderness. The jungle didn't need to fight you, it just needed to wear you down. And it did. Every movement became a calculation. Is that just a branch, or is it a bamboo viper coiled in ambush? Is that itch from a mosquito bite, or is a leech crawling up your inner thigh? Can I lie down here for an hour, or will an entire column of fire ants eat through my skin while I sleep? And worst of all, you couldn't show fear. A patrol couldn't afford to break discipline just because something hissed in the dark or crawled into your boot. Crying out, swatting, even flinching could give away your position. So you suffered in silence, because the jungle listened. Worse still, the jungle smelled you. Australian soldiers quickly learned that even their own gear worked against them. Standard issue soaps, detergents, even the metal smell of gun oil could alert animals and enemy trackers long before you arrived. SAS teams stopped using soap altogether. They rolled in mud to cover their scent. They hung their sweat-soaked clothes in trees to let them rot, to become part of the jungle. But it was never enough. The jungle always found a way in, through the soles of your boots, the sleeves of your blouse, the rim of your canteen. It soaked into your skin, your lungs, your soul. The SAS understood this better than most. They didn't try to beat the jungle. They learned to respect it, to fear it, to adapt. Because if you didn't, it would kill you long before the enemy ever got the chance. And it wouldn't need a bullet to do it. Just a bite, a sting, a fever that started in your toes and worked its way toward your brain while you slept. In silence. The jungle wasn't evil. It was just hungry, and it never stopped hunting. There are two kinds of fear in the jungle: the fear you hear coming, and the fear that waits without a sound. Snakes belong to the second kind. For Australian SAS patrols operating deep in enemy territory, Few things caused more quiet dread than Vietnam's venomous snakes. You could prepare for firefights, you could train for ambushes, but you couldn't always spot the thing that might kill you from a low branch or under your sleeping mat. The bamboo viper, small, green, and nearly invisible in the foliage, was a master of camouflage. Perched silently on branches just above eye level, it blended perfectly with the jungle's filtered light. One SAS scout described crawling through a patch of bamboo when his face stopped inches from a pair of slitted eyes. The snake never moved. Neither did he. For over a minute, man and predator remained frozen, until the viper, perhaps bored or disinterested, slowly slipped away. Not every man was that lucky. Unlike in open combat, snake bites didn't come with warning. You might feel a sharp prick on the ankle, or nothing at all. Then the burning would start, then the shaking, then the blur in your vision. And in the jungle, there was no cavalry coming, no medevac in 30 minutes, no field hospital down the road. If you were deep in a recon mission, the nearest help could be days away. And that's if you dared call for extraction, risking the whole team's position. The Malayan pit viper and cobra brought different dangers. The pit viper loved leaf litter, striking ankles from beneath. Cobras could stand and flare from meters away, but sometimes stayed hidden under logs or ruins, striking when a curious hand reached into the wrong shadow. And then there was the banded crate, beautiful, patterned, and almost graceful. But its neurotoxic venom was fast and final. One SAS trooper was bitten while setting a claymore mine in dense undergrowth. He died within an hour, slipping into respiratory paralysis while his team was forced to watch. The jungle stayed silent throughout. Snakes didn't just kill, they disrupted. A single bite could bring a patrol to a halt. The victim had to be carried. Every movement slowed. The team's footprint increased. The risk of detection soared. In some cases, teams had to make brutal decisions. Risk the mission and all their lives, or leave the bitten man behind. Veterans remembered those moments with a haunted clarity. "We didn't hate the snakes," one said years later. "They were just doing what snakes do. But we never stopped fearing them. Because unlike a soldier with a gun, they didn't care who you were. They didn't think. They didn't miss. They just struck. And if they got you, it was already too late." In the Vietnamese jungle, snakes weren't just animals. They were traps with eyes, coiled assassins in a war that didn't need to see you to kill you. And the only warning you got was the sound of your own heartbeat, right before it stopped. If snakes were the silent assassins of the jungle, then Vietnam's insects and parasites were its torturers. Slow, persistent, merciless. They rarely killed outright, but they broke down morale, discipline, and even sanity. For Australian soldiers, especially SAS patrols lying motionless within arm's reach of enemy forces, these tiny creatures became some of the most insidious enemies they ever faced. The first tormentors they met were leeches, land leeches, tree leeches, river leeches. They didn't care where you walked, crawled, or slept. They found you, always, and they didn't wait for you to stop moving. They dropped from leaves. They launched from wet ground. They crawled inside boots, crotches, ears, even armpits. One SAS trooper described a moment during a silent observation stop when he felt something cold and slimy wriggling deep between his toes. He couldn't move, couldn't twitch, couldn't even hiss in discomfort. He lay there for hours as the leech fed, swelling until it bulged against the fabric of his sock. Leeches didn't hurt, that was the worst part. They numbed their bite. You only realized they were there when your blood was already soaking through your shirt or dribbling down your leg. And once they detached, the wound wouldn't close for hours. Every patrol had men with blood-stained ankles or thighs. It wasn't deadly, but it was draining, literally and mentally. Then came ants. Not the harmless kind, not the kind you brushed off. Vietnam's jungle had fire ants that could turn a footstep into a scream trapped behind clenched teeth. Entire nests could swarm a man in seconds if he shifted weight onto the wrong patch of ground. For a regular infantryman, this was agony. For an SAS trooper on a silent ambush line, it was torture. There were documented cases of soldiers forced to endure hundreds of bites while remaining perfectly still, because moving meant compromising the entire team. And if ants weren't enough, The jungle had wasps and bees whose nests hung low and camouflaged, waiting to explode in a frenzy if disturbed. One patrol stumbled too close to a ground wasp nest while setting up an observation post. The stings came fast and merciless. Faces swelled, eyes shut, lips ballooned, yet they kept silent because noise meant death. Night was no refuge. Mosquitoes whined endlessly. Sandflies left welts that turned into infections. Spiders crawled across exposed skin. Men learned not to slap, not to scratch, not to react. Pain became background noise, another sound to quiet in the mind. And that was the true danger. These creatures didn't kill the body. They killed focus. And SS Patrol had to remain invisible for hours, sometimes days. But a man fighting ants under his shirt or a hornet sting under his eye wasn't thinking about camouflage or foot traffic. He was thinking about agony, about panic, about escape. In this way, the jungle didn't need venom or claws to win. It only needed persistence. Because in Vietnam, the wildlife didn't just attack the flesh, it attacked the mind. And the mind was far easier to break. The bullets weren't always what killed you. Sometimes it was a scratch. In the Vietnamese jungle, even the smallest wound could become a death sentence. Not because of the cut itself, but because of what crawled into it afterward. Australian SAS patrols, often spending days or even weeks without resupply or medical support, knew this well. Their bodies weren't just carrying weight, they were slowly deteriorating. A blister from tight boots, a cracked fingernail, a small leech bite, any of it could become a portal for rot, fungus, or disease. Jungle rot was the quiet reaper. It started as a rash, then skin peeled, then it split, exposing raw flesh to dirt and bacteria. Men walked on feet that bled into their socks. Others developed ulcers under the armpits, at the groin, behind the knees, places where sweat never dried and friction was constant. Antibiotic cream was packed like gold, but it ran out fast, and there was never enough. Some of the worst cases didn't even come from cuts. They came from leeches inside the body. In rivers and swamps, SAS operators often had no choice but to wade through chest-deep water. Many wore no underwear, not out of comfort, but because it reduced friction and dried faster. But it came at a cost. Leeches, thinner than shoelaces, would swim up the urethra or into the rectum, anchoring inside. You wouldn't even know they were there until you started urinating blood, or until fatigue hit and wouldn't leave. A few soldiers collapsed without wounds, their energy gone, their blood count dropping. A medic would later find the culprit, bloated and black, lodged where no knife could reach safely. And then there was the air itself. The jungle was full of spores, molds, bacteria. Just breathing could cause infection. Some men developed persistent coughs that wouldn't go away. Others grew fevers that had no name, no clear origin, just heat that rose in waves through the night. You'd wake up shivering in 35 Rasters heat, unable to eat, unable to walk, and still have to crawl through bamboo the next morning. SAS teams prepared for this. They carried antifungal powders. They dried their socks in shifts. They rotated boots to keep feet aired. They learned how to sleep off the ground, how to wrap wounds in jungle leaves if supplies ran out. But sometimes nature didn't care. The infection would still come. Not fast, not loud, just steady. Eating away at the body like rust on steel. And the worst part? You couldn't complain. A single groan in the wrong place could mean the entire team was compromised. So you endured. You limped in silence. You fought the fever with clenched fists. You tried not to scratch the rot off your legs. Because in the end, the jungle didn't need to shoot you. It just needed time. And time was something the Australian SAS had in short supply. The jungle may not have taken sides, but the Viet Cong knew it fought for them. Australian SAS teams operated under the assumption that they were being watched, not just by men, but by insects, birds, scent trails, and shifting patterns in the canopy. But what made the jungle deadly wasn't just the wildlife. It was how the enemy used it as a silent ally. The VC and NVA had grown up in this terrain. They had learned where the snakes hunted and when the ants moved. They knew which rivers spawned fever and which vines carried skin-eating fungi. More than that, they understood when foreign soldiers were most vulnerable, not when they were fresh, but when they were broken by exhaustion, infection, and fear of invisible enemies with fangs and stingers. They studied how Western troops responded to jungle pressure, and they waited. SAS patrols, for all their discipline and training, were not immune to the wear. After 5 days deep in enemy territory with bleeding feet, infected rashes, and bodies drained by parasites, alertness dipped. Eyes darted slower, ears stopped picking up faint footfalls. Even silence began to lose meaning when pain filled your skull. That's when ambushes came. Many small-scale contacts occurred not during high-tempo movement, but during pauses, during crossing of streams, when boots were off, when leeches struck, when someone crouched down to urinate blood, or during low morale nights when men stayed too close together under one tarp, ignoring spacing discipline because they were soaked, cold, and weak. The VC watched for signs: uneven spacing, louder than usual rustling, erratic movement. These weren't tactical errors. They were biological surrender. The jungle had done the first half of the kill. All the enemy had to do was finish the job. In one case near the Long High Hills, an Australian reconnaissance element had pushed into thick secondary growth after 5 days of near-constant rain. The patrol leader had been bitten by a centipede and had developed a fever. Another trooper's feet were soaked and bleeding. While halted for a short rest, the unit was bracketed by gunfire. Not from a long chase, not from a lucky encounter. The VC had watched and waited, knowing the team was operating below peak. Wildlife wasn't just nature, it was a weapon system. It blurred the line between biological decay and tactical exposure. It numbed instincts. It dulled the razor edge that SAS depended on for survival. The Vietnamese didn't need to attack hardened patrols at full strength. They let the jungle strip the armor, one mosquito, one infection, one sleepless night at a time. And when the Australians finally reached the edge of their endurance, that's when the real enemy struck. The jungle didn't care if you were elite. It broke men just the same. But the Australian SAS learned something most units never did. You don't beat the jungle, you become part of it. Unlike conventional infantry, SAS patrols didn't try to fight the terrain or push through it. They listened to it, studied it, let it teach them. Over time, they developed habits, techniques, and a mindset that allowed them not only to survive, but to disappear inside it. First came the clothing. Standard issue boots quickly rotted, so SAS troopers adapted by drilling drainage holes or carrying spares. Socks were rotated constantly, one dry, one worn. They used antifungal powder obsessively and slept with their feet out of the bag, elevated off the ground. Every man carried small vials of sulfur powder, tobacco solution, and crude homemade repellents, not just to avoid leeches, but to keep their nervous system sharp. Sleep-deprived, infected men made noise. Noise got people killed. Next came sleep discipline. Unlike regular troops, the SAS never slept near tree bases, where snakes often nested. They strung up hammocks or makeshift raised planks, even if it took hours to build. It wasn't about comfort. It was about controlling the risk. One bite could compromise an entire mission. Fire ants and wasps? You couldn't stop them, but you could learn where not to walk. Veterans developed an instinct. Don't disturb leaf patterns. Don't brush vines. Avoid dark holes. Patrol leaders made decisions not just based on terrain, but on where wildlife might be most active that hour. They even changed how they smelled. Soap was banned. Deodorant was suicide. Troopers rubbed themselves in mud and charcoal, let sweat dry into their fatigues, hung their shirts in trees for days until they blended into the odor of rotting leaves. One SAS veteran joked that by the end of a mission, even the wildlife avoided them. But this wasn't about tricks, it was about philosophy. The SAS didn't just fear the jungle, they respected it, and that respect turned into edge. They trained to endure discomfort without reaction. If fire ants crawled across your stomach while you were in ambush position, you let them. If mosquitoes fed on your neck, you didn't swat, because staying silent meant staying alive. Over time, that discipline became second nature. Their minds hardened. Pain faded. Instincts took over. One instructor put it bluntly: the jungle is a test. Pass it, and you're invisible. Fail it, and it eats you alive. That was the line between regular soldiers and SAS phantoms. Not better weapons, not better muscles, better understanding. They didn't fight the jungle. They merged with it. And in doing so, They became the thing even the Viet Cong feared. Predators that moved without sound, slept without fire, and left no scent behind. By the time an Australian SAS patrol emerged from the jungle, mud-caked, blood-drawn, eyes sunken from days without real rest, they didn't look like soldiers anymore. They looked like something the jungle had grown, and in a way, they were. The jungle in Vietnam didn't care who was right or who wore which uniform. It didn't pick sides. It didn't care if you were brave or strong or the best trained unit in the world. The vines would still wrap around your legs. The leeches would still drink your blood. The snakes would still strike if you stepped too close. The rot would still find your skin, even under camouflage. It was nature at its most indifferent. But for the SAS, survival wasn't just about toughness. It was about humility. Understanding that even the most elite training meant nothing if you didn't listen to what the land was telling you. It meant accepting that the most dangerous enemy might not be an NVA unit in the trees, but something waiting silently in the leaf litter. There's a quiet kind of trauma that comes with this war. Not the loud scars of explosions or the sudden horror of a firefight, but the slow erasure of the self, bite by bite, sting by sting, day by day, as the jungle strips you down to instinct, to discipline, to silence. And that silence stays with you. Many SAS veterans spoke little about the wildlife after the war, not because it wasn't serious, but because it was constant. It was normal. It was the background to every mission, every movement, every breath. But in their journals, their after-action reports, and the way they stared into the middle distance when asked about certain patrols, you could still see it. The jungle took a piece of them, yet in that crucible something else was forged. The SAS didn't just survive Vietnam. They adapted in a way few other forces did. They learned to move without disturbing the undergrowth, to count enemy footsteps without ever being seen, to let fire ants crawl across their skin and snakes slither past their boots and remain completely still. That level of control, mental, physical, spiritual, is what made them ghosts, and sometimes what made them legends. There's an old saying among Australian recon troops: you don't fight the jungle, you let it forget you're there. For the SAS, that wasn't poetry, it was doctrine. Life or death. The only way to walk back out of a place that wanted to bury you in silence. Because in Vietnam, the jungle didn't hate you, it just didn't care if you lived, and that made it the most honest killer of them all.